Welcome. Tonight, we rest in the stillness of ancient wisdom, where the Buddha's teachings have echoed through temple halls and mountain hermitages for more than 2,000 years. These are not merely stories, but transmissions of understanding, gentle explorations of the truths that can set us free from suffering and guide us toward peace. The Buddha taught that all suffering arises from clinging, from our desperate attempts to hold on to what is constantly changing, to make permanent what is inherently impermanent. And he taught, too, that there is a path out of this suffering, a way of being that accepts change, that releases attachment, that finds peace not in controlling life, but in understanding it deeply. Tonight, you will meet people who are learning these lessons, who are walking this ancient path in their own ways, in their own time. Their stories unfold slowly, like lotus petals opening to the sun, revealing truths that cannot be forced but only received with patience and presence. So settle yourself now. Let your body find its natural rest. Let your breath flow easily, without effort or control. There is nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to become. Simply be here, in this moment, and let these teachings wash over you like water over stones, shaping you gently, slowly, in ways you may not even notice until long after. Close your eyes, listen, and let the first teaching begin. There was a young monk who had come to the monastery with a heart full of questions and a mind burning with the need to understand. He had read the sutras, had memorized the teachings, had studied the commentaries, and yet he felt no closer to enlightenment than when he had begun. The words were in his head, but they had not reached his heart, had not transformed the way he experienced the world. He lived in a small cell in the monastery, barely large enough for a sleeping mat and a shelf for his few possessions, and every morning he rose before dawn and made his way to the meditation hall. The walk from his cell to the hall was perhaps 50 paces down a covered corridor that overlooked the monastery courtyard, and he had walked this path 1,000 times, his mind always racing ahead to the meditation, to what he hoped to achieve, to the enlightenment he was so desperately seeking. On this particular morning, he woke in darkness and dressed quickly, pulling on his robes with practiced efficiency. The air was cold, and he could see his breath in small clouds as he stepped out into the corridor. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, a pale gray band along the horizon, and the stars were still visible overhead, though fading. He began to walk toward the meditation hall, his feet moving automatically along the familiar path, and his mind was already spinning with thoughts about the meditation to come. He was thinking about a passage from the Heart Sutra he had read the night before, about form and emptiness, and he was trying to understand it intellectually, trying to grasp it with his thinking mind. But then something happened. His foot came down on a fallen leaf, and the leaf made a small crackling sound under his weight, and for some reason that sound penetrated his thinking, broke through the wall of concepts and words, and suddenly he was completely present, completely here, in this corridor, on this morning, with this leaf. He stopped walking. He looked down at the leaf beneath his foot, and he saw it clearly for the first time, not as an idea of a leaf, not as something to be stepped over or ignored, but as an actual, specific, particular leaf. It was brown and curled at the edges, with delicate veins that branched out like rivers on a map, and it was brittle with age, its color faded by sun and rain. He bent down and picked it up, and he held it in his palm, and he looked at it with complete attention. He saw the way the morning light caught on its surface, the tiny imperfections in its form, the places where insects had eaten small holes, the stem that had once connected it to the branch. He turned it over and saw the underside, paler and smoother, and he felt its texture, dry and paper-thin, fragile. And as he held this leaf, something shifted in his understanding. This leaf had once been part of a tree, had been green and alive, had photosynthesized sunlight and breathed out oxygen, had danced in the wind and provided shade. It had gone through its season of life, and then, when the time came, it had fallen. And now it was here, in his hand, at the end of its journey, ready to return to the earth. The monk stood there for a long time, holding the leaf, and he began to see something he had never truly seen before, despite all his studying, despite all his memorization of the teachings. He saw impermanence, not as a concept, not as a word in a sutra, but as a living reality, as the actual truth of how things are. This leaf would not exist forever. It would crumble to dust, would be absorbed into the soil, would become nutrients for new growth, for new leaves, for new life. And the tree it had come from would also not last forever. Eventually it would die, would fall, would decay and return to the earth. And the monastery itself, these ancient buildings of wood and stone, would also not last forever. In time, they too would crumble and fall, would be reclaimed by the forest, would disappear as if they had never been. And he himself, this young monk with his questions and his seeking and his desperate desire for enlightenment, he too was impermanent, was constantly changing, was moving moment by moment toward his own inevitable death and dissolution. The body he inhabited was aging even now, cells dying and being replaced, tissues wearing down, the whole complex system gradually unwinding. He had known this intellectually, of course. The teaching of impermanence was fundamental, was repeated in every text, every discourse, but knowing it intellectually and seeing it directly were two entirely different things. Now, holding this leaf, he saw it with his whole being, felt it in his body, understood it in a way that went beyond words. And with this seeing came a strange kind of peace. If everything was impermanent, if nothing lasted, then there was nothing to cling to, nothing to hold on to in a desperate attempt to make it permanent. The very fact of impermanence meant that clinging was futile, was the source of suffering, because you could never succeed in holding on to what was constantly slipping away. The first noble truth, life, contains suffering. The second noble truth, suffering, arises from craving and clinging. He had studied these truths, had recited them, but now he understood them, not with his mind, but with something deeper, something more immediate. He set the leaf down gently on the ground, and he continued walking toward the meditation hall, but he walked differently now. His feet touched the wooden boards with awareness, and he felt each step, felt the slight give of the wood, heard the soft sound of his footfall. He noticed the way the light was changing as the sun rose, the way the shadows were shifting and lengthening. He noticed the cool air on his face, the sound of a bird calling somewhere in the courtyard, the smell of incense drifting from the hall. Every moment was different. Every moment was arising and passing away, and in that constant flow, in that endless change, there was nothing solid to grasp, nothing permanent to depend on. And somehow, this realization, which might have been terrifying, was instead liberating. The monk entered the meditation hall and took his place among the other monks, settling onto his cushion with a new quality of presence. The hall was large and dim, with high wooden beams and narrow windows that let in bars of pale morning light. The air smelled of incense and old wood, and the silence was deep and complete, broken only by the occasional sound of shifting cloth or a quiet breath. The meditation bell rang. a single clear note that hung in the air and slowly faded, and the monks settled into stillness. The young monk closed his eyes and brought his attention to his breath, and for the first time in all his months of practice, he did not try to control it, did not try to make it deeper or slower or more refined. He simply observed it, noticed it as it was sometimes shallow, sometimes deep, sometimes smooth, sometimes irregular. And as he observed his breath, he saw that it too was impermanent, was constantly changing. Each in-breath different from the last, each out-breath unique. He saw that his thoughts were impermanent, arising and passing away like clouds in the sky, some lasting only a moment, others lingering longer but eventually dissolving. He saw that the sensations in his body were impermanent, a slight pain in his knee arising and intensifying and then fading, an itch appearing and disappearing, warmth and coolness shifting and flowing. Everything was in motion, nothing was fixed. And trying to hold on to any of it, trying to make any of it permanent, was like trying to grasp water in your hands. It simply flowed through your fingers, leaving you empty-handed and frustrated. He sat with this understanding, and gradually, a profound stillness began to settle over him. Not a stillness of the body, which still shifted and adjusted, or a stillness of the mind, which still produced thoughts, but a stillness of being, a deep acceptance of the way things were. He was not fighting against impermanence anymore, not trying to find something solid and permanent to stand on. He was simply being with what was, moment by moment, breath by breath. The meditation continued for an hour, perhaps more, and when the bell rang again to signal the end, the young monk opened his eyes slowly, and the hall looked different to him. The light had changed, streaming in from a different angle, and he could see dust particles floating in the beams, appearing and disappearing, each one unique, each one temporary. He could see the grain of the wooden floor, patterns that had been created over years of growth, now visible for this brief moment, before they too would fade and disappear. He rose with the other monks and bowed to the altar, and as he walked back to his cell, he noticed everything with the same quality of attention he had brought to the leaf. The texture of the corridor wall, rough wood worn smooth in places by the touch of countless hands. The distant sound of water running somewhere, a stream or a fountain. The way the light fell across the courtyard, creating patterns of sun and shadow that would never repeat exactly the same way again. Over the following days, the young monk continued to practice with this new understanding. He noticed impermanence in everything in the food he ate, which changed flavor and texture with each bite. In the conversations he had with other monks, which arose and ended and were never quite the same. In the weather, which shifted from rain to sun to clouds and back again in endless variation. And as he noticed impermanence, he also began to notice something else, his own attachment, his own clinging, the subtle ways he tried to hold on to pleasant experiences and push away unpleasant ones. When the food was good, he wanted more, wanted it to last, felt disappointment when the meal ended. When his meditation was peaceful, he tried to recreate that peace the next day, felt frustrated when it didn't come. When the weather was beautiful, he felt a sadness knowing it would change. That rain would come, that cold would return. This clinging, he saw, was the source of his suffering. Not the impermanence itself, but his resistance to it, his desire for things to be other than they were, his attachment to pleasant experiences and his aversion to unpleasant ones. The third noble truth came alive for him: there is an end to suffering. And the fourth noble truth, the path to that end, is the eightfold path. Right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. He began to see the path not as something separate from his daily life, not as a special set of practices to be done in the meditation hall, but as a way of being present with each moment, each experience, each breath. Right mindfulness was simply this: paying attention, being aware, seeing things as they actually were rather than as he wished them to be. One afternoon, he was assigned to work in the monastery garden, and he found himself pulling weeds from between the vegetable rows. It was simple work, repetitive and humble, and in the past he might have done it impatiently, rushing through it to get back to his studies, his reading, his pursuit of enlightenment. But now he pulled each weed with complete attention, noticing the resistance of the roots in the soil, the way the plant came free with a soft tearing sound, the smell of earth and green growing things. He noticed the vegetables growing in the rows, bok choy and radishes and beans, each one at a different stage of growth, each one moving through its own cycle of seed to sprout, to leaf, to flower, to fruit, to decay. And as he worked, he understood that this was the practice, this was the path, not something separate from ordinary life, not something to be achieved in some future moment of enlightenment, but simply this being fully present with what is, moment by moment, accepting the impermanence, releasing the clinging, opening to the flow. That evening, as the sun set and the sky filled with color, the young monk walked to a quiet corner of the monastery grounds where there was a small shrine beneath an old Bodhi tree. He sat down on a stone bench and looked up at the tree, its leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze, and he thought about the Buddha, who had sat beneath a tree much like this one and had seen into the nature of reality, had understood suffering and its causes and the path to its end. The Buddha had not found enlightenment through intellectual study, or through striving, or through desperate seeking. He had found it through presence, through deep observation, through releasing attachment and opening to what is. And now, sitting beneath this tree, the young monk felt a profound gratitude for these teachings, for the path that had been laid out for him, for the possibility of freedom from suffering. He did not feel enlightened. He did not feel that he had arrived at some final destination, but he felt different, changed, as if a tight knot inside him had begun to loosen. He felt less desperate, less driven, more at peace with the process of learning, with the reality of being a student, a beginner, someone who had just barely begun to understand. He sat there until the stars came out, watching the light fade from the sky, watching the darkness deepen, and he felt a great tenderness for this world, this impermanent, constantly changing world where nothing lasted, but everything was beautiful precisely because it didn't last. A flower was precious because it would fade. A moment was valuable because it would pass. Life was meaningful because it would end. He stood finally and bowed to the tree, to the Buddha, to the teachings, and he walked slowly back to his cell. He prepared for bed simply and mindfully, washing his face, folding his robes, laying out his sleeping mat. And when he lay down and closed his eyes, he brought the same quality of attention to the process of falling asleep, noticing the way his body relaxed, the way his thoughts slowed, the way consciousness gradually released its hold and allowed sleep to come. As the young monk drifted into sleep, he felt a profound peace settling over him. The questions were still there. The desire to understand was still present, but it was gentler now, less urgent, less demanding. He could rest in not knowing, could trust the process of gradual awakening, could accept that enlightenment, if it came, would come in its own time, not because he had forced it or earned it, but because he had learned to stop fighting, to stop clinging, to stop trying to make permanent what was always meant to flow. He felt his breath slowing, deepening, and he noticed it with gentle awareness, not trying to control it, just allowing it to be. He felt his body sinking into the mat, releasing the day, releasing the tension, releasing the effort. And he felt his mind growing quieter, thoughts arising and passing like birds flying across the sky, leaving no trace, requiring nothing. And as he settled deeper into sleep, he remembered the leaf, that simple brown leaf that had taught him more than all his studying, and he felt a wave of gratitude for it, for the way it had appeared at exactly the right moment, for the teaching it had offered simply by being what it was, impermanent, fragile, beautiful, complete. The night held him gently, and his breath flowed in and out like waves on a shore. And somewhere in the depths of his being, a small understanding continued to grow, like a seed planted in dark soil, waiting patiently for the right conditions to sprout and bloom and bear fruit. And all was well. All was exactly as it needed to be. All was part of the great flow of arising and passing away, of birth and death and rebirth, of suffering and the end of suffering, of seeking and finding and finally, learning to rest. And in another part of the monastery, where the meditation caves are carved into the mountainside, another teaching waits to unfold. There was an old nun who had lived in the monastery for more than 40 years, and she had dedicated her life to the practice of compassion. She had studied the Bodhisattva path, the way of the one who vows to liberate all beings before entering final peace, and she had taken this vow seriously, had made it the foundation of her practice, the guiding principle of her life. But lately, she had been struggling. The world seemed to be filled with so much suffering, war and famine and disease, cruelty and ignorance and pain, and she felt overwhelmed by it, crushed by the weight of all the beings who were suffering, all the beings she had vowed to help. How could she possibly fulfill her vow? How could one person, one old woman in a remote monastery, make any difference in the face of such vast and terrible suffering? She spent hours in meditation, trying to generate loving kindness, trying to extend compassion to all beings, but instead of peace, she felt despair. Instead of the warm, open-hearted feeling she had once known, she felt a cold tightness in her chest, a sense of failure and inadequacy that grew with each passing day. On this particular morning, she woke before dawn, as she always did, and she made her way to one of the meditation caves that were carved into the cliff face behind the monastery. These caves had been used for solitary practice for centuries, and each one was simple, just a small chamber with a dirt floor and a natural shelf of rock for an altar. The cave she had chosen faced east, and in the mornings, the first light would come directly through the entrance, filling the space with a soft golden glow. She entered the cave and lit a small oil lamp, placing it on the altar beside a simple clay statue of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. The statue was old and weathered, its features softened by time, and she had looked at it thousands of times, had prayed before it, had taken refuge in its presence. But this morning, as she knelt on her cushion and looked at the statue, she felt nothing. No devotion, no connection, no sense of the compassion it was meant to represent, just emptiness and a deep, aching sadness. She closed her eyes and tried to begin her practice, tried to generate the feeling of loving kindness by thinking about beings she loved, her teacher, her fellow nuns, the villagers who brought offerings to the monastery. But even as she thought about them, she felt a distance, a separation, as if there were a wall between her and the compassion she was trying to cultivate. She sat there for a long time, struggling, and finally, she gave up. She opened her eyes and looked around the cave, at the rough stone walls, at the packed earth floor, at the simple altar, and she noticed, for the first time, a small spider web in the corner, near the ceiling, where the rock formed a natural alcove. The nun looked at the spider web, and she saw that a spider was sitting in the center of it, very still, waiting. The web was delicate and intricate, strands radiating out from the center in a perfect geometric pattern, and the morning light caught on the threads, making them glow like fine silver wire. She watched the spider for a long time, forgetting her practice, forgetting her despair, simply observing. And as she watched, she saw a small fly land on the edge of the web, and immediately the spider moved, quick and precise, wrapping the fly in silk, securing it for later. This was the nature of the spider, to weave webs and catch prey, to survive by taking life. And the nun felt a complicated response to this. Part of her wanted to save the fly, wanted to intervene, wanted to prevent the suffering. But another part of her recognized that this was simply what spiders do, that the spider was not cruel or evil, that it was simply following its nature, doing what it needed to do to survive. And she thought about the teaching of dependent origination, the understanding that all things arise in dependence on causes and conditions, that nothing exists independently, that everything is connected in an endless web of relationships. The spider depended on the fly for food. The fly depended on plants for nectar. The plants depended on soil and water and sun. The soil depended on decay and death. Everything feeding everything else, everything arising from something else, nothing existing on its own. And suffering too arose from causes and conditions. The suffering she saw in the world was not random or meaningless, but was the result of ignorance, of craving, of actions that created harm. And her own suffering, this despair she felt about not being able to save everyone, also arose from causes and conditions, from her attachment to an idea of herself as savior, from her desire for the world to be different than it was, from her resistance to the reality of suffering. She had been thinking of compassion as something she needed to generate, something she needed to create and project out into the world. But what if compassion was not something she did, but something she allowed? What if it was already present, inherent in the nature of awareness itself, and her job was simply to remove the obstacles that blocked it, to release the clinging and the judging and the need to fix everything? The nun sat with this understanding, and she brought her attention back to her breath. But this time, she did not try to generate any particular feeling. She simply breathed and noticed and allowed whatever was present to be present. And gradually, something began to shift. The tightness in her chest began to ease, and in its place came a gentler feeling, a tender openness. She thought about the spider and the fly, and instead of judgment or the need to intervene, she felt a simple recognition: this is how things are. Suffering exists, death exists, life feeds on life, and within that reality there is also beauty, also wisdom, also the possibility of awakening. Her compassion did not need to be heroic or dramatic. It did not need to save every being or solve every problem. It could simply be this: a willingness to be present with suffering, her own and others, without turning away, without numbing herself, without drowning in despair. A willingness to respond when response was possible, to help when help was needed, but also to accept what could not be changed, to trust that each being was on their own journey, learning their own lessons. She thought about Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, and the teaching that the bodhisattva had 1,000 arms, each arm holding a different tool for helping beings. But the bodhisattva also had 1,000 eyes, seeing suffering everywhere, and those eyes did not close in despair. They remained open, witnessing, present, compassionate but not overwhelmed. The key, she realized, was equanimity. Compassion without equanimity became despair. Compassion with equanimity became wisdom. She could care deeply about all beings without needing to personally fix all suffering. She could hold the suffering of the world with tenderness and strength, acknowledging it, honoring it, but also accepting that suffering is part of the fabric of existence, and that the path to its end is not through her heroic effort, but through each being's own awakening to the truth. She looked again at the spider web, and she felt a great softness toward the spider, toward the fly, toward herself, toward all beings caught in the web of existence, all struggling in their own ways, all seeking happiness, all trying to avoid pain, and she understood that her compassion could extend to all of them equally, without preference, without hierarchy, because all were equally caught in ignorance, all were equally worthy of love, all were equally deserving of the possibility of awakening. The nun continued to sit in the cave as the sun rose higher and the light shifted from golden to silver to the clear white of morning. She sat with an open heart, not trying to generate compassion, but simply resting in the natural compassion that arises when we truly see suffering, when we truly understand the causes of suffering, when we truly recognize our deep connection to all beings. She thought about her vow to liberate all beings, and she understood it differently now. She could not personally save everyone that was grandiose, was actually a form of ego, a subtle attachment to being special or important, but she could contribute to the conditions that make awakening possible. She could practice with sincerity, could embody the teachings, could offer what she had learned to those who were ready to receive it. She could be a light in the darkness, not the only light, but one among many, part of the great web of support that spans across time and space, connecting all practitioners, all seekers, all beings who turn toward liberation. And she could start small, right here, with the beings immediately around her, with the other nuns in the monastery, offering them kindness and patience, with the villagers who came for teachings, listening to their struggles with genuine care, with the spiders and flies and birds and all the small lives that shared this mountain, extending to them the same tender awareness she was learning to extend to herself. She remembered a teaching from the Metta Sutta, the discourse on loving kindness, just as a mother would protect her only child with her life. Even so, let one cultivate a boundless heart towards all beings. Boundless, but also realistic. The mother protects her child with her life, but she does not prevent every small pain, every scraped knee, every disappointment. She provides love and support and guidance, but she also allows the child to learn, to grow, to face the challenges that will make them strong. This was compassion with wisdom. This was the middle path between indifference and drowning in the suffering of others. This was the way of the Bodhisattva, who vows to save all beings while understanding that each being must save themselves, must walk their own path, must discover their own truth. As the morning advanced, the nun finally rose from her meditation and bowed to the altar, to Avalokiteshvara, to the spider and its web, to the cave itself which had held her through her struggle and her discovery. She stepped out into the bright sunlight and stood on the narrow ledge outside the cave, looking down at the monastery below and the valley beyond. From this height, everything looked small and peaceful: the monastery buildings with their curved roofs, the gardens and paths, the village in the distance, the river winding through the valley. She could not see the individual struggles happening down there, the specific pains and fears and griefs, but she knew they were present, knew that each building held lives filled with both joy and suffering, with both wisdom and ignorance, and she sent out a blessing, not a fixing or a saving, but a simple wish. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings find the path to peace. May all beings awaken to their true nature. She did not need to make it happen. She simply held the intention, the aspiration, and she trusted that intentions matter, that aspirations have power, that the collective field of compassion created by all practitioners across all time creates a kind of spiritual momentum that supports all beings in their journey toward liberation. She walked slowly back down the mountain path to the monastery, and she noticed the beauty around her, the wildflowers growing between the rocks, the butterflies dancing in the sunlight, the sound of birds singing in the trees. And she felt her heart opening to it all, to the beauty and the suffering, to the joy and the pain, to the entire spectrum of existence. When she reached the monastery, she went to the kitchen to help prepare the midday meal, and she worked alongside the other nuns with a new quality of presence. She chopped vegetables with care, feeling the weight of the knife, the texture of the food, the simple satisfaction of useful work. She stirred the pot on the stove, watching the steam rise, smelling the spices, tending the fire. And when the meal was ready and the nuns gathered to eat, she served them with genuine love, seeing in each face the same struggle she had experienced, the same desire for peace, the same fundamental goodness. And she ate her own meal with gratitude, tasting each bite, nourishing this temporary body that was the vehicle for her practice, her instrument for helping others. That evening, after the day's work was done and the evening meditation was complete, the nun returned to her small room and prepared for sleep. She lit a single candle and sat for a moment in quiet reflection, looking back over the day, over the teaching she had received in the cave, over the shift in understanding that had occurred. She felt different, lighter, more at peace. The despair had lifted, replaced by a gentle determination, a quiet commitment to continue the practice, to continue cultivating compassion and wisdom, not for some grand purpose or heroic achievement, but simply because it was the path, simply because it was what made sense, what felt true. She thought about all the beings who were settling into sleep at this same moment, humans and animals, insects and birds, each one seeking rest, each one moving through their own cycle of waking and sleeping, living and dying. And she felt connected to them all, part of the same great web of existence, the same dependent origination, the same flow of causes and conditions. She blew out the candle and lay down on her mat, pulling a thin blanket over herself. The room was dark and quiet, and through the small window, she could see stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. She closed her eyes and brought her attention to her breath, and she silently repeated the phrases of loving kindness, not as a forced generation of feeling, but as a natural expression of the compassion that was already present. May I be peaceful. May I be happy. May I be free from suffering. May all beings be peaceful. May all beings be happy. May all beings be free from suffering. As the nun drifted into sleep, she felt held by something larger than herself, something vast and compassionate and endlessly patient. The web of interconnection, the great field of awareness, the Buddha nature that exists in all beings, hidden sometimes but never absent, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be awakened. Her breath slowed and deepened, and her body relaxed completely, releasing the day, releasing the effort, releasing even the practice itself. And in that release, in that letting go, there was a profound peace, a recognition that she did not need to carry the weight of all suffering, that the universe was unfolding exactly as it needed to unfold, that her part was simply to be present, to be aware, to offer what she could offer and trust that it was enough. And the night held her gently, as it held all beings, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and somewhere a spider tended its web, and somewhere a fly sought rest, and somewhere the great wheel of birth and death and rebirth continued its endless turning. And within that turning, within that constant change, there was also the possibility of awakening, the possibility of freedom, the possibility of love. And all was well. All was exactly as it needed to be. All was held in the boundless heart of compassion that asks nothing and gives everything and never, ever turns away. And now, in the deepest part of the monastery, where senior monks practice in silence, one final teaching prepares to reveal itself. There was a meditation master who had been practicing for more than 50 years, and he was known throughout the region for his deep insight and his skill in guiding students. He had taught hundreds of monks and nuns, had given countless Dharma talks, had written commentaries on the sutras that were studied in monasteries across the land. People spoke of him with reverence, and students came from far away to receive his teachings. But the master carried a secret burden. Despite all his years of practice, despite all his understanding and his skill, he had not fully released the sense of self, the subtle identification with being the master, the teacher, the enlightened one. It was a very refined form of ego, almost invisible, but it was there, a slight tension, a small holding that prevented complete freedom. He knew this. He had seen it clearly in his meditation, had recognized the subtle ways he held on to his identity, his reputation, his role, and he had tried to release it, had practiced letting go, had investigated the nature of self deeply and repeatedly. But still it remained, this last trace of clinging, this final obstacle. On this particular morning, the master woke in his small room in the senior monk's quarters, and he knew immediately that something was different. His body felt heavy and hot, and when he tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He was sick, seriously sick, though he did not yet know with what. He managed to stand and dress, moving slowly, and he made his way to the meditation hall for morning practice. But halfway through the meditation, he had to leave, stumbling out of the hall and back to his room, where he collapsed on his mat, too weak to move. The monastery's physician was called, and after examining him, the physician's face was grave. "It is a fever," he said quietly, "a serious one. You must rest completely. No teaching, no meditation, no duties. Just rest and try to recover." The master nodded, but inside, he felt a rising panic. If he could not teach, if he could not practice, if he could not fulfill his role, then who was he? What was he? His entire identity for 50 years had been built on being the teacher, the practitioner, the one who guided others. Without that, what remained? Over the following days, the fever deepened, and the master lay on his mat, too weak to do anything but breathe and endure. The physical suffering was intense, burning heat, aching muscles, a throat so dry that swallowing was agony. But the mental suffering was worse. His mind, which had been so clear and controlled for so many years, now wandered chaotically, producing fears and doubts and regrets. He thought about all the students he had taught, and he worried that he had led them astray, that his teaching had been flawed, that his own incomplete liberation had infected his guidance. He thought about his reputation, and he felt shame that he was lying here, helpless and weak, No longer the strong and capable master, but just a sick old man who needed others to bring him water and food. And beneath all these thoughts, there was a deeper fear, the fear of death. He had taught about death countless times, had explained impermanence and the illusory nature of the self, had guided dying students with words of wisdom and comfort. But now, facing it himself, feeling his body weakening day by day, he felt raw terror, a primal clinging to existence that all his years of practice had not eliminated. One night, when the fever was at its worst, he lay in the darkness and felt himself dissolving. The boundaries of his body seemed to blur, and he could not tell where he ended and the room began. His thoughts were fragmenting, breaking apart like ice in spring, and the solid sense of being him, being the master, being anyone at all, was slipping away. And in that dissolution, in that loss of everything he had thought he was, something unexpected happened. The fear suddenly released, like a fist that had been clenched for decades finally opening. And in the space where the fear had been, there was something else, a vast, open awareness, empty of content but full of presence. Not the master's awareness, not anyone's awareness, just awareness itself, boundless and free. He saw in that moment what he had been seeking all along. The self he had been trying to release was already gone, had never truly existed. What he had taken to be himself was just a collection of thoughts and memories and habits and identifications, constantly changing, constantly flowing, with no solid core, no permanent essence. The teaching of anatta, no self, suddenly became not a concept, but a direct experience. There was no one here to be enlightened, no one here to teach, no one here to protect or defend or maintain. Just this awareness, presence, the simple fact of being, empty of self but full of life. The fever broke that night, and by morning, the master was cooler, clearer, though still very weak. The physician came and examined him and looked relieved. "The worst has passed," he said. "You will recover, though it will take time." The master nodded, but he felt no relief, no joy, no particular emotion at all. He simply rested in the clarity that had come, the understanding that had finally, fully settled. Over the following weeks, as his strength slowly returned, the master did not resume his teaching immediately. He told the abbot that he needed more time to recover, and instead of returning to the meditation hall and the Dharma talks and the private meetings with students, he took on simple work in the monastery, sweeping paths, washing dishes, tending the vegetable garden. The other monks were puzzled. Why would the great master spend his time doing novice work? But he did not explain. He simply worked quietly, with complete attention. And in the working, he found a peace he had never known before. When he swept the path, there was just sweeping the movement of the broom, the sound of bristles on stone, the gathering of leaves. No one sweeping, no master performing a humble task, just the activity itself, complete and sufficient. When he washed dishes, there was just washing the warmth of the water, the slide of cloth over ceramic, the clean cup placed on the rack to dry. When he tended the garden, there was just tending the feel of soil, the green of growing plants, the small miracle of life emerging from seed. And in all of this simple work, he understood the teaching that he had been pointing toward for 50 years but had never fully embodied, that enlightenment is not a special state achieved by special people through special practices, but simply the recognition of what is already here, already true, already complete. The ordinary mind, the everyday activities, the simple presence, this is it. This has always been it. One day, a young monk approached him as he was working in the garden and asked shyly, "Master, When will you resume teaching? We miss your Dharma talks." The master looked at him and smiled. "I am teaching," he said. "Right now. Can you see it?" The young monk looked confused, and the master laughed gently. "Look," he said, gesturing to the garden. "These vegetables grow not because I will them to grow, not because I make them grow through effort or technique. They grow because conditions are right: soil, water, sun, seed. My job is simply to provide the conditions and then step aside. This is the teaching. Do you understand?" The young monk frowned, thinking hard, and then his face cleared. "You mean that awakening is the same? We cannot force it, only create the conditions and allow it to unfold naturally?" "Yes," the master said. "And also this: who is the we that creates conditions? Who is the I that allows things to unfold? Look deeply at this question, and you will find the heart of the teaching." Eventually, the master did return to teaching, but he taught differently now. He spoke less, listened more. He gave fewer elaborate explanations and instead asked simple questions, offered small observations, pointed to the immediate experience rather than constructing complex philosophical frameworks. When students came to him with questions about enlightenment, he would ask them, "Who is asking? Find the one who wants to be enlightened and show them to me." When students spoke about their struggles with meditation, he would ask, "Who is struggling? Can you find the one who is having difficulty?" When students worried about their progress on the path, he would ask, "Where is this path? Who is traveling on it? Show me the traveler, separate from the traveling." And gradually, some students began to understand the self they were trying to perfect, the self they were trying to enlighten, the self they were trying to liberate. This self was the very thing that needed to be seen through, recognized as empty, released not because it was bad, but because it was illusory. The master taught that the path was paradoxical. You had to practice as if there were someone practicing, but ultimately recognize that there was no one there at all. You had to make effort, but not identify with the one making effort. You had to walk the path while understanding that there was nowhere to go, nothing to achieve, no one to become. This was the middle way, the razor's edge between nihilism and eternalism, between denying the conventional reality of self and clinging to the ultimate reality of no self. Both were true, both were necessary, and the wisdom was in holding them both lightly, playing in the paradox rather than trying to resolve it. One evening, during a Dharma talk, a student asked, "Master, if there is no self, then who is reborn? What continues from one life to the next?" The master was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "When one candle lights another, does the flame move from one candle to the other, or is it a new flame? When a wave rises in the ocean, is it separate from the ocean, or is it the ocean temporarily taking the form of a wave?" Rebirth is like this, a continuation of patterns, of karmic formations, but not the continuation of a fixed, permanent self. The patterns flow on. Cause gives rise to effect, but there is no unchanging essence that transmigrates. The student looked thoughtful, and the master continued, "But here is the deeper question: why do you need to know?" The Buddha refused to answer certain questions because they did not lead to liberation. Whether there is rebirth or not, whether the universe is eternal or not, these questions are less important than this one. Are you suffering right now, in this moment? And can you find freedom from that suffering? Focus on that, and the rest will take care of itself. As the years passed, the master grew older, and his body continued to weaken. He walked more slowly, needed help with tasks that had once been easy, spent more time resting. But his teaching became clearer, more direct, stripped of all unnecessary complexity. He told his students, "After I die, do not build statues of me or create elaborate rituals in my memory. I am not important. The teaching is what matters, and the teaching is simple. Pay attention, be kind, let go. Everything else is decoration." He told them, the real monastery is not this building, these walls. The real monastery is your own mind, your own heart. Practice there, and you can practice anywhere. He told them, "I have nothing to give you that you do not already have. I can only point, only suggest that you look where you are not used to looking. The treasure is already yours. You are already home. You are already free. You simply need to recognize it." One evening, the master felt a deep tiredness come over him, and he knew that his time was close. He called his closest students to him and sat with them in the meditation hall, and the light was soft and golden, filtering through the wooden slats of the windows. "I will be leaving soon," he said quietly. "Not going anywhere really, just releasing this particular form, this particular arrangement of elements. But before I go, I want to tell you one final thing." The students leaned in, waiting, and he smiled at their earnestness. "The final thing is this: there is nothing final. No last word, no ultimate truth that I can give you that will make everything clear. The mystery remains a mystery, and that is fine, that is perfect. Do not seek to eliminate the mystery. Simply live it, be it, allow it to unfold moment by moment. And in that allowing, you will find everything you need." That night, the master lay down on his mat, and he knew it would be for the last time. He felt no fear, no resistance, no regret. His body was ready to stop, and he was ready to allow it. He brought his attention to his breath, as he had done countless times over 50 years of practice, but now it was different. There was no sense of someone meditating, no practitioner observing the practice. There was just breathing, just the rise and fall of sensation, just awareness holding it all with perfect equanimity. He thought about his students, and he sent them a final blessing. May they find what they seek. May they see through the illusion of separation. May they rest in the natural peace that is always here. He thought about the monastery, the buildings and gardens and paths that had been his home for so long, and he felt gratitude for the shelter they had provided, for the beauty they had offered, for the countless moments of practice they had held. He thought about the teachings, the ancient wisdom that had been passed down through generations, from the Buddha to his disciples to their disciples, an unbroken chain of transmission reaching across centuries. And he felt honored to have been a link in that chain, to have received the teachings and passed them on, to have played his small part in the great work of awakening. And then he released even these thoughts, and there was just the darkness of the room, the coolness of the air, the softness of the mat beneath him, the faint sound of someone walking in the corridor outside. The simple, perfect presence of this moment, complete in itself, requiring nothing, lacking nothing. His breath slowed, grew shallower, and he felt his awareness beginning to expand, to dissolve beyond the boundaries of body and mind, merging with the vast space that had always been there, always been here, the space in which all things arise and pass away, the space that is not separate from the things but is their very nature, their very essence. And as the master released his final breath, there was no fear, no grasping, no sense of loss, just a gentle letting go, a return to the source, a recognition that what was dying had never truly been born, that what was ending had never truly been separate from the endless flow. And in the monastery, the monks who were sitting in night meditation felt a ripple pass through them, a subtle shift in the energy, and they knew without being told that the master had passed. They continued sitting, honoring his teaching in the only way that truly mattered, by being present, by paying attention, by releasing attachment even to the teacher himself. And the night held them all gently, the living and the dead, the sleeping and the waking, the masters and the students, the enlightened and the seekers, all held in the same boundless awareness, all arising from the same source, all returning to the same vast emptiness that is not empty but full, not nothing but everything, not the end but the beginning that never begins and the ending that never ends. And all was well, all was complete, all was exactly as it had always been and would always be, perfect, whole, free. There was a merchant who had spent his entire life accumulating wealth. He owned several shops in the valley below the monastery, and his storerooms were filled with silk and tea and spices brought from distant lands. He had a large house, fine clothes, servants who attended to his needs, and enough gold to ensure comfort for many generations. By the standards of the world, he was successful, even enviable. But the merchant could not sleep. Night after night, he lay awake worrying about his inventory, about his competitors, about the possibility of theft or fire or economic collapse. He worried about his health failing before he could enjoy his wealth, about his children squandering what he had built, about dying and leaving it all behind. The more he accumulated, the more he had to protect, and the protection itself became a burden heavier than poverty had ever been. One morning, exhausted and desperate, he decided to visit the monastery. He had heard of the monks who lived there, simple people who owned nothing but seemed somehow content, and he thought perhaps they could give him something, a talisman, a prayer, some technique for finding peace that would allow him to keep his wealth and also sleep at night. He climbed the mountain path slowly, unused to physical exertion, stopping frequently to catch his breath and wipe the sweat from his face. The path was steep and rocky, and his fine shoes were not made for such walking. Several times he considered turning back, but something drove him forward, some deep exhaustion that was greater than the exhaustion of the climb. When he finally reached the monastery gates, it was late afternoon, and the light was beginning to soften into evening. A young monk greeted him at the gate and led him through the courtyard to a simple guest house, a small building with a single room containing a sleeping mat, a low table, and nothing else. "The abbot will see you after evening meditation," the young monk said. "You are welcome to join us in the hall if you wish, or you may rest here." The merchant looked around the sparse room and felt a strange discomfort. He was used to rooms filled with furniture and decorations, with evidence of wealth and status. This emptiness felt almost hostile, as if the room itself were judging him. He sat down on the mat, intending to rest for just a moment, but the climb had exhausted him more than he realized, and within minutes he fell into a deep sleep. When the merchant woke, it was dark, and for a moment he did not know where he was. He sat up in confusion, and then memory returned: the monastery, the climb, the sparse room. Through the small window, he could see stars, thick and bright in the mountain air, and he could hear the distant sound of bells, probably signaling the end of evening meditation. He stood and made his way out of the guest house, following the sound of voices to the meditation hall. The doors were open, and inside, he could see the monks rising from their cushions, bowing to the altar, beginning to file out. He stood to the side as they passed, and several nodded to him in greeting, their faces calm and open. When the hall was empty except for one old monk who was extinguishing the lamps, the merchant approached hesitantly. "Excuse me," he said. "I was told the abbot would see me." The old monk turned and looked at him with clear, direct eyes. "I am the abbot," he said. "What brings you to our monastery?" The merchant felt suddenly foolish, standing there in his fine robes, his problems seeming trivial in the face of this monk's simple dignity. But he had come this far, so he spoke. "I cannot sleep," he said. "I have everything a man could want, but I am tormented by worry. I thought perhaps you could help me find peace." The abbot was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Come, walk with me." They walked out of the hall and into the monastery gardens, where vegetables grew in neat rows and fruit trees stood dark against the evening sky. The abbot walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, and the merchant followed, waiting for advice, for instruction, for some wisdom that would solve his problem. But the abbot said nothing. He simply walked, pausing occasionally to examine a plant, to touch a leaf, to look up at the stars. And gradually, the merchant found his own mind beginning to quiet, drawn into the rhythm of the walking, into the stillness of the evening. After a long time, the abbot stopped beside a small pond where lotus flowers grew, their white petals glowing faintly in the starlight. He pointed to one of the flowers and said, "Tell me, what does this lotus own?" The merchant looked at the flower, puzzled. "Nothing," he said. "It's a flower. It doesn't own anything. And yet it blooms." The abbot said, "And yet it is beautiful. And yet it is complete, exactly as it is. Tell me, is this flower worried about the future? Is it anxious about what might happen tomorrow?" "No," the merchant said slowly, "but it's just a flower. It doesn't have responsibilities, doesn't have people depending on it, doesn't have—" The abbot held up his hand gently. The Buddha taught about the second noble truth, that suffering arises from tanha, from craving, from clinging. You cling to your wealth because you believe it will make you secure, will make you happy. But the very act of clinging is what creates your suffering. The more you have, the more you fear losing it. The tighter you grip, the more painful the holding becomes. The merchant felt something twist in his chest, a recognition that was uncomfortable, almost painful. But if I don't hold on to what I have, I'll lose everything. Someone will take it. It will disappear. Perhaps, the abbot said, or perhaps not. But let me ask you, you have accumulated great wealth, yes? And has it brought you peace? Has it brought you the security you sought? The merchant wanted to say yes, wanted to defend his life's work, but he found he could not. The truth was obvious, undeniable. "No," he admitted quietly, "it has brought me only more worry. This is because you are operating under a fundamental misunderstanding," the abbot said. "You believe that security comes from accumulation, from building walls around yourself, from controlling and protecting. But true security comes from the opposite, from releasing, from opening, from understanding that you cannot control what is inherently uncontrollable." They began walking again, and the abbot continued speaking, his voice soft but clear in the night air. "Everything you own is already in the process of passing away. Your silk will rot, your tea will go stale, your spices will lose their potency, your gold will be spent or inherited or stolen, your body will age and die." This is not pessimism, this is simply the truth of impermanence. And when you truly understand this, when you accept it completely, then you are free, because you stop trying to make permanent what is temporary. You stop clinging to what cannot be held. But then what is the point? The merchant asked, and he heard the desperation in his own voice. What is the point of working, of building, of trying to create anything if it's all going to disappear? The abbot smiled. Ah, now you are asking the right question. The point is not in the accumulation, not in the permanence. The point is in the present moment, in the act itself. You can work and build and create, but do it with open hands, with the understanding that what you create is not yours to keep, that it will flow through you and then flow on, like water through a river. Work not for the sake of accumulating, but for the sake of the work itself, for the joy of creating, for the service you provide to others. And then release it. Let it go. Do not cling. The merchant walked in silence, his mind churning with these ideas, struggling against them, and also, in some deep part of himself, recognizing their truth. They returned to the guest house, and the abbot stopped at the door. "Tomorrow," he said, "I invite you to join us in our daily work. See how we live, what we practice, and then decide for yourself what brings peace." The next morning, the merchant rose with the monks before dawn and joined them in the meditation hall. He had never meditated before, and sitting still was torture. His legs hurt, his back ached, his mind raced with thoughts about his business, his responsibilities, all the things he should be doing instead of sitting here wasting time. But he stayed, and gradually something began to shift. The thoughts continued, but they seemed less urgent, less compelling. They arose and passed away, and he noticed that he could observe them without being completely caught by them. It was like watching clouds pass across the sky. They came, they went, but the sky itself remained clear and spacious. After meditation, he joined the monks in their morning work. He was given simple tasks: sweeping the courtyard, carrying water, helping in the kitchen. The work was humble, beneath his status, and at first he felt humiliated. But the monks treated the work with such care, such attention, that he found himself drawn into it, into the simple rhythm of doing one thing at a time, completely. When he swept, there was just sweeping. When he carried water, there was just the weight of the bucket, the coolness of the water, the movement of his feet. When he chopped vegetables in the kitchen, there was just the knife, the cutting board, the clean slice through carrot and radish. And in these simple acts, he found something unexpected, a kind of peace, a momentary freedom from the constant churning of worry and planning and protecting. At midday, the monks gathered for a simple meal, and the merchant sat with them, eating rice and vegetables from a plain clay bowl. The food was nothing special, nothing like the elaborate meals he was used to, but it tasted good, and he found himself eating slowly, actually tasting it, actually experiencing the simple satisfaction of nourishment. After the meal, the abbot invited him to walk in the forest behind the monastery. They followed a narrow path through tall trees, and sunlight filtered through the canopy in bars of gold and shadow. The abbot walked in silence, and the merchant, following his example, also said nothing, simply walked and noticed. He noticed the smell of pine and earth. He noticed the sound of birds calling and the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. He noticed the way the light changed as clouds passed over the sun, the way the shadows shifted and danced. And he noticed, too, how his mind kept trying to pull him away, kept generating thoughts about his business, his worries, his plans. But each time he noticed this, he brought his attention back to the present moment, back to the walking, back to the forest, back to what was actually here rather than what might happen later or what had happened before. And each time he did this, he felt a small easing, a small release of the tight knot of anxiety that had lived in his chest for so long. They came to a clearing where a stream ran over smooth stones, and the abbot sat down on a large rock beside the water. The merchant sat beside him, and they watched the stream flow, clear and constant, moving over the rocks and around obstacles, always finding its way. The Buddha taught about the Eightfold Path, the abbot said after a time. Right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Notice that right does not mean perfect or rigid. It means appropriate, balanced, aligned with wisdom rather than with ignorance. He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the stream, and they watched the ripples spread and fade. Right livelihood means work that does not cause harm, that serves rather than exploits, that is done with awareness and ethics. You are a merchant. This can be right livelihood if you approach it correctly. Provide good products at fair prices. Treat your workers and customers with respect and honesty. Earn what you need, give generously, and do not hoard out of fear. But how do I know what I need? The merchant asked. How do I know when I have enough? You will know when you stop being driven by fear, the abbot said. When you can sleep at night, when you can enjoy what you have without constantly grasping for more, when you can give freely without feeling diminished. These are the signs of having enough. The merchant thought about his storerooms full of goods, his coffers full of gold, and he felt a wave of something like shame. How much of it did he actually need? How much was simply accumulation for its own sake, the endless trying to fill a void that could never be filled by external things? The teaching of anatta, no self, is relevant here, the abbot continued. You think of yourself as the merchant, as the wealthy man, as the successful businessman, but these are just labels, just temporary identities. Who are you beneath these roles? What remains when you strip away the possessions, the status, the achievements? The merchant wanted to answer, but he found he could not. Who was he without his wealth? Without his identity as a successful merchant? The question opened a void inside him that was terrifying and also, strangely, inviting. What if there was freedom in that void? What if the emptiness was not something to fear but something to explore? The merchant spent 3 more days at the monastery, falling into the rhythm of the monk's life rising before dawn, meditating, working, eating simply, walking in silence, sitting by the stream or in the garden, watching the sun move across the sky and the stars emerge at night. And each day he felt lighter. The constant churning of his mind began to slow, and in the spaces between thoughts, he caught glimpses of something he had forgotten existed: peace, simple presence, the capacity to just be without needing to do or have or become anything. On the 4th morning, he met with the abbot one final time before descending the mountain. I don't want to go back, he said honestly. Here, I feel peace. But down there, in my life, I know the worries will return. They will return, the abbot agreed. But you do not have to be owned by them. You have learned something here, that peace is possible, that it comes not from controlling circumstances, but from changing your relationship to circumstances. Now you must practice this in your daily life, in the midst of your work and your responsibilities. This is the real test, the real practice. But how? The merchant asked. I'm not a monk. I can't meditate for hours every day. I can't give up my business and live simply. You don't have to, the abbot said. The Buddha did not teach that everyone must become monks. He taught that everyone can practice, can wake up, can find freedom within their own life, whatever that life looks like. Meditate, for even 10 minutes each morning. Bring mindfulness to your daily work. Practice generosity. Give freely without expectation. Speak honestly. Act ethically. Treat all beings with kindness. These are not separate from your work. These are how you transform your work into practice. The abbot reached into his robe and pulled out a small, smooth stone, one he had picked up from the stream. "Take this," he said. "Keep it in your pocket, and when you notice it, when you feel its weight or texture, let it remind you. Remind you that everything is impermanent, that clinging causes suffering, that peace is available in this moment if you stop grasping and simply open to what is." The merchant descended the mountain path with the stone in his pocket and a lightness in his step that had not been there when he climbed up. When he reached the valley and saw his large house, his shops, his storerooms, he felt the old anxiety begin to rise, but he also felt something new, a capacity to observe it, to recognize it as just a feeling, just a pattern of thought, not the truth of who he was. He went to his house and looked at it with new eyes. It was large, yes, but did he need all this space? He looked at his possessions, the fine furniture, the decorations, the clothes, and he asked himself honestly what brought him joy and what was simply accumulation. Over the following weeks, he began to make changes. He gave away many of his possessions to those who needed them more. He reduced his inventory to what was reasonable, what he could actually manage without constant stress. He started paying his workers more generously and treating them with greater respect and care. He set aside a portion of his profits for charity, supporting the monastery and helping the poor in the village. And he established a daily practice. Each morning, before beginning work, he sat in meditation for 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes, but 10 minutes of coming back to presence, of releasing the grasping mind, of remembering what the abbot had taught him. Throughout the day, he would reach into his pocket and feel the stone, and each time he did, he would pause, take a breath, notice where his mind had gone, and bring it back to the present moment. At night, before sleep, he would review the day not with judgment, but with awareness. Where had he been caught in craving or aversion? Where had he acted with wisdom and compassion? What had he learned? And then he would let it all go, would release the day completely and allow himself to rest. And slowly, over months and years, he found that he could sleep. The anxiety did not disappear completely. He was still human, still had responsibilities and challenges, but it no longer controlled him. He could hold his work lightly, could engage fully while also understanding that none of it was permanent, none of it defined him, none of it was worth sacrificing his peace. Many years later, when the merchant was old and his children had taken over the business, he made one final trip up the mountain to the monastery. The abbot who had taught him had long since passed away, but the new abbot welcomed him warmly, and they sat together in the same garden, beside the same pond with its lotus flowers. "I came to say thank you," the merchant said. "Your predecessor saved my life. He showed me how to live with open hands, how to work without clinging, how to find peace in the midst of the world." The new abbot smiled. "He simply pointed you back to yourself, to the wisdom that was already there. Tell me, do you still have the stone?" The merchant reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, smooth stone, worn even smoother now by years of being held and touched. "I do," he said. "It has been my teacher all these years, reminding me of impermanence, of the practice, of the path." "And what have you learned?" the abbot asked. The merchant thought for a long moment, turning the stone over in his hands. "I have learned that the Buddha's teaching is true, that suffering comes from craving and clinging, and that peace comes from releasing, from accepting impermanence, from opening to what is. I have learned that wealth is not the problem, nor is poverty the solution. The problem is attachment, and the solution is wisdom, is seeing clearly, is letting go. He paused and then continued. I have learned that I am not the merchant, not the wealthy man, not the father or the husband or any of the roles I play. These are temporary costumes, temporary identities. Beneath them all is just this awareness, presence, the simple fact of being alive in this moment. And this cannot be lost, cannot be taken away, because it was never mine to begin with. It simply is. The new abbot nodded. You have learned well, he said. The Dharma has taken root in your heart. Now you can pass it on, can help others find the same freedom you have found. That is my intention, the merchant said, for whatever time remains. That evening, the merchant stayed at the monastery as a guest, and he joined the evening meditation in the hall where he had first struggled to sit still all those years ago. Now, sitting came easily, naturally, and he settled onto the cushion with a sense of coming home, of returning to something familiar and true. The bell rang, and the hall fell silent, and he brought his attention to his breath, to the rise and fall of sensation, to the simple presence of being here, now, in this moment. And as he sat, he felt a profound gratitude not for anything specific, but for everything, for the whole journey, for the suffering that had driven him to seek, for the teaching that had shown him the way, for the practice that had transformed his life. He thought about all the beings who were still caught in the same cycle he had been caught in, accumulating and protecting, grasping and fearing, driven by the belief that security comes from external things, that happiness can be found in possession and control. And he felt a deep compassion for them, for their struggle, for their suffering. And he made a quiet vow to live the teaching as fully as he could, to embody the Dharma in his daily life, to be an example of what is possible when you release the clinging and open to the flow. Not to preach or proselytize, but simply to be, to live with integrity and wisdom and kindness, and to trust that this itself is a teaching, a transmission, a light in the darkness. The meditation ended, and he rose and bowed and walked slowly back to the guest house. He prepared for sleep simply and mindfully, and when he lay down on the mat, he felt a complete peace, a total acceptance of this moment, this life, this impermanent, constantly changing, utterly precious existence. He reached into his pocket one last time and felt the stone, and he smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow he would descend the mountain and return to his life, but he would carry this peace with him, would carry the Dharma in his heart, would continue the practice until his final breath. And as the merchant settled into sleep, he felt the boundaries between self and world beginning to dissolve, felt himself merging with the darkness, with the silence, with the vast awareness that held all things. And in that dissolving, there was no fear, only peace, only the recognition that this simple presence, this boundless awareness had been here all along, waiting patiently beneath the layers of clinging and identification and fear. His breath slowed and deepened, and his body relaxed completely, releasing into the mat, into the earth, into the great holding of existence. And as sleep came, he felt himself carried gently into the darkness, like a leaf floating on a stream, surrendering to the current, trusting completely. And the night held him, and the monastery held him, and the Dharma held him, and beneath it all, the Buddha's teaching continued to echo across the centuries. Suffering exists, suffering has a cause, Suffering can end, and there is a path to its ending. Simple truths, profound truths, truths that could transform any life, any heart. If only they were received, if only they were practiced, if only they were lived, and all was well. All was exactly as it needed to be. All was held in the boundless compassion that sees all beings, knows all suffering, and offers always, always the possibility of freedom. And now, in the silence that follows all teachings, one final story rises to meet the night. There was a nun who had been practicing meditation for many years, but despite her dedication, despite her discipline, she had never experienced the deep insight she sought. She had read the sutras, had studied with teachers, had spent countless hours on her cushion, but enlightenment remained elusive, distant, like a horizon that receded with every step she took toward it. She lived in a small hermitage high on the mountain, above the main monastery, in a simple cave that had been used by practitioners for generations. The cave was barely large enough for a sleeping mat and a meditation cushion, and it faced east, so that each morning the first light would fall directly on her as she sat. She had chosen this isolated practice, believing that if she just worked hard enough, if she just concentrated intensely enough, if she just pushed through all obstacles with fierce determination, she would break through to understanding. But the years passed, and the breakthrough did not come, and gradually she felt herself hardening, becoming rigid and desperate. Her practice no longer a joy but a grim duty, a battle she was determined to win. On this particular morning, she woke in the darkness feeling utterly exhausted. Her body ached from hours of sitting. Her mind was cluttered with doubts and frustrations, and she felt a deep despair rising in her chest. What was the point? What was she doing here, wasting her life in this cave, pursuing something that clearly was not meant for her? She sat up on her mat and looked toward the cave entrance, where the sky was just beginning to lighten, and she made a decision. She would do one more meditation session, and if nothing happened, if there was no breakthrough, no insight, no taste of the freedom she sought, she would give up. She would leave the cave, return to the valley, resume a normal life. She had tried, and she had failed, and that would have to be enough. The nun settled onto her meditation cushion with a sense of finality, a resignation that was almost peaceful. She had released the outcome, had stopped demanding that this session produce results. If it was her last meditation, then so be it. She would simply sit and be present, and then let it all go. She closed her eyes and brought her attention to her breath, but this time, she did not try to control it, did not try to make it deep or smooth or regular. She simply observed it as it was sometimes shallow, sometimes deep, sometimes smooth, sometimes ragged. Just breath, arising and passing, moment by moment. And as she observed, something began to happen. Without the pressure of needing to achieve, without the striving and the grasping, her mind began to settle naturally, like muddy water clearing when left undisturbed. Thoughts still arose, but they seemed less sticky, less compelling. They came and went like visitors, and she did not need to engage with them, did not need to push them away or follow them. They were just thoughts, just mental events, arising from conditions and passing when conditions changed. She noticed physical sensations, a pain in her knee, an itch on her cheek, warmth on her face, as the sun rose and light entered the cave. And she noticed her reactions to these sensations, the aversion to pain, the desire to scratch the itch, the pleasant feeling of warmth, but she did not act on these reactions. She simply observed them, noticed how they too arose and passed, how the pain intensified and then faded, how the itch appeared and then disappeared on its own, how the warmth grew and then stabilized. And in this simple observation, without interfering, without trying to control or fix or achieve anything, she began to see something she had never seen before. She saw that there was awareness of the breath, but no one breathing. There were thoughts, but no thinker. There were sensations, but no one experiencing them. Just phenomena arising and passing in awareness, moment by moment, with no solid self at the center, no permanent observer, no one home. This recognition was not dramatic. There was no flash of light, no overwhelming emotion, no sense of having achieved something great. It was subtle, quiet, almost ordinary, and yet it was also profound, revolutionary, the complete overturning of everything she had believed about herself and reality. The nun continued sitting, and the insight deepened. She saw that what she had been calling I was just a collection of processes, physical sensations, thoughts, emotions, memories, all arising and passing in dependence on conditions, with no permanent essence, no unchanging core. The belief in a solid, separate self was revealed as a fiction, a convenient story that the mind told itself, but not an accurate description of what was actually happening. And with this seeing came a profound release. If there was no solid self, then there was no one to protect, no one to improve, no one to enlighten. The whole project of seeking enlightenment for herself was revealed as absurd, as based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Enlightenment was not something that happened to a self. Enlightenment was the recognition that there had never been a self to begin with. This was the teaching of sunyata, emptiness, not as a void or a nothingness, but as the absence of inherent, independent existence. All phenomena, including the one she had called myself, were empty of self-nature, were interdependent, arising together in a vast web of relationship, none of them existing on their own, all of them flowing and changing and interpenetrating. And paradoxically, this emptiness was not depressing or nihilistic. It was liberating, joyful even, because if there was no solid self to protect, then there was also no solid self to suffer. Suffering arose when there was clinging, when the mind grasped at experience and tried to make it permanent, tried to make it mine. But when clinging was released, when the emptiness of self was clearly seen, suffering simply dissolved, like mist in sunlight. The nun opened her eyes, and the cave looked different. The rock walls, the dirt floor, the simple altar, all of it appeared with a clarity and vividness she had never noticed before. And yet at the same time, it all appeared empty, transparent, not solid things, but processes, events, patterns of energy and awareness arising and passing. She looked at her hands, and she saw them in the same way, not as solid objects that belonged to her, but as temporary formations of elements, constantly changing, interdependent with everything else. Her hands were connected to the food she had eaten, which was connected to the soil and sun and rain, which was connected to the entire cosmos. Where did her hands begin and the universe end? There was no clear boundary, no solid line of separation. She stood slowly and walked to the cave entrance, and she looked out at the valley below, at the monastery buildings and the gardens and the river winding through the landscape. And she saw it all as one unified field, not separate things, but one continuous flow, one seamless reality expressing itself in infinite forms. The nuns spent the rest of that day in the cave, sitting and walking and simply being, resting in the understanding that had arisen. And as the day progressed, the insight stabilized, became not just a momentary glimpse, but a fundamental shift in her way of seeing, her way of being. She understood now why all her previous efforts had failed. She had been trying to achieve enlightenment, to gain something she didn't have, to become someone different than she was. But enlightenment was not an achievement or a gain. It was a recognition, a seeing through, a release. It was not becoming someone new, but seeing clearly what had always been true, that the self she had been trying to improve was a fiction, that freedom was not somewhere else but right here, not in some future moment, but in this one. She thought about all the teachings she had studied, and they came alive now with new meaning. The Four Noble Truths, which had seemed like a roadmap to follow, were revealed as a description of what was actually happening. Suffering exists. The grasping, the clinging, the identification with a false self. Suffering has a cause, ignorance of emptiness, belief in a solid self. Suffering can end through seeing clearly, and there is a path, the eightfold path of wisdom, ethics, and meditation. The teaching of the three marks of existence, impermanence, suffering, and no self, were not abstract concepts but direct observations of reality. Everything was impermanent, constantly changing, because nothing had a solid, independent existence. Suffering arose from clinging to what was impermanent, trying to make it permanent. And no self was not a philosophical position, but a simple fact. When you looked for a solid, unchanging self, you could not find it. There was no one home, just processes arising and passing. The nun felt a profound gratitude for the Buddha, for his willingness to share what he had discovered, for his compassion in offering these teachings to all beings. And she felt grateful for her teachers, for their guidance and patience. Even though they could not give her the understanding directly, she had to discover it herself, had to see it with her own eyes. And she felt grateful, too, for all the years of struggle, for all the frustration and doubt and despair. Because without that struggle, without hitting the wall of her own striving, she might never have let go, might never have stopped demanding and simply opened to what was already here. As evening approached, the nun heard footsteps on the path leading to her cave, and she looked out to see the abbot of the monastery climbing slowly toward her. He was very old, and the climb was difficult for him, but he came anyway, as he had done occasionally over the years to check on her practice. When he reached the cave, he stood in the entrance catching his breath, and then he looked at her, and his eyes widened slightly. "Ah," he said quietly, "you have seen it." She smiled, and it was a different smile than he had seen on her face before, open, relaxed, without the tension of seeking. "Yes," she said, "or perhaps more accurately, the seeing has happened. There is no one here who has seen anything." The abbot laughed, a deep, joyful sound. "Yes, exactly. And now what will you do?" She looked out at the valley, at the fading light, at the world that was both empty and full, both suffering and free. "I will come down from the mountain," she said. "I will teach if there are those who wish to learn. I will serve if there is work to be done. I will continue to practice, not to achieve anything, but simply because practice is what arises, what is appropriate, what is here." "Good," the abbot said. "The hermitage is a valuable place for intensive practice, but the Dharma must be lived in the world, must be embodied in action and relationship. Come down, share what you have discovered, and continue to deepen, because understanding is not static. It continues to unfold, to reveal new layers, new subtleties. They sat together in the cave as the sun set and the sky filled with color, and they did not speak much, simply rested in the shared understanding, in the companionship of the Dharma. And when the stars began to appear, the abbot stood to make his way back down the mountain, and the nun bowed deeply to him in gratitude. "Tomorrow," she said, "I will begin packing, and I will come down." The nun spent one final night in the cave, and as she lay on her mat preparing for sleep, she felt a complex mixture of emotions: sadness to be leaving this place that had been her home for so long, gratitude for the understanding that had arisen here, and anticipation for the new phase of practice that awaited her below. She thought about the years she had spent here, the countless hours of sitting, the struggles and the breakthroughs, the despair and the joy. And she saw now that all of it had been necessary, had been part of the path, had been the conditions that led to this moment of clarity. Nothing was wasted. Every difficulty had been a teacher. Every frustration had been an invitation to look deeper, to question more thoroughly, to let go more completely. She thought about the students she might teach, and she felt compassion for them, knowing they would face their own struggles, their own doubts, their own moments of despair. And she understood that she could not give them the understanding directly, could not save them from the necessary work of practice, but she could point, could offer guidance, could share what she had learned, and trust that those who were ready would hear it, would take it in, would find their own way to the freedom that was always available, always here. She closed her eyes and brought her attention to her breath one more time, not as a practice now, not as a striving, but simply as a resting place, a gentle anchor in the present moment. And as she felt herself drifting towards sleep, she felt a profound peace, a deep acceptance of everything exactly as it was. There was nothing to achieve, nowhere to go, no one to become. Just this awareness, presence, the simple fact of being, empty of self and full of life, moment by moment, breath by breath, constantly changing and utterly complete. And as the nun released into sleep, the cave held her gently, as it had held countless practitioners before her and would hold countless practitioners after. And the mountain held the cave, and the earth held the mountain, and the universe held the earth, and awareness held the universe. And there was no separation anywhere, just one continuous flow, one seamless reality, one boundless presence expressing itself in infinite forms. And all was well, all was complete, all was exactly as it had always been and would always be, empty of inherent existence and full of provisional forms, free from suffering and compassionate toward all who suffer, awakened to the truth and dedicated to helping all beings awaken to that same truth. And the teachings of the Buddha continued to echo across time and space, simple and profound, available to all, asking nothing but offering everything: the end of suffering, the path to freedom, the recognition of what has always been true. Let go, wake up, see clearly, be free. And now, as these ancient teachings settle into the silence of the night, let yourself settle too. The Buddha's wisdom has been offered tonight through these stories: impermanence, no self, the causes of suffering, the path to freedom, not as abstract philosophy, but as lived experience, as the struggles and insights of real practitioners walking the path. You don't need to understand it all. You don't need to achieve anything tonight. The teachings will continue working in you, slowly, gently, like seeds planted in rich soil, waiting for the right conditions to sprout and grow. For now, simply rest. Let your body relax completely. Let your breath flow naturally. Let your mind release its grip on thoughts and worries and plans. The Dharma holds you. The ancient lineage of practitioners holds you. The Buddha's compassion, extending across 25 centuries, holds you. And in that holding, you are safe, you are free, you are already home. Sleep now in the peace of these teachings. Rest in the understanding that freedom is possible, that suffering can end, that the path is always here, always available, always waiting patiently for you to take the next step. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings find peace. May all beings awaken to their true nature. Rest well.